Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We're continuing in our series of ideas about God throughout Jewish history as they can relate to the Siddur. And we've been talking about Hasidism, and I added in it may be that the point last week about distractions during prayer, what to do about distractions during prayer, was clear, but I'm going to continue with that theme today. It could be partly because I've actually been studying some of these sections with a chavruta, and so I like these pieces of Torah, and so I just want to share more of them with you. So we talked some last week about, just to refresh your memory, about distractions, thoughts that come to you during prayer, seeing the Baal Shem Tov's approach of trying to see them as opportunities. Where do those thoughts come from? Why are you having them? It's possible that there is something positive or, in the religious framework, divine about the source of those thoughts. And maybe they are, they have some divine core or some thread that leads you back to the divine, which is just obscured or distorted by schmutz. In Kabbalistic, Hasidic theological terms, what that means, the way they express it is, it could be that there is something there from one of what we would have called the Sfirot, one of the aspects of God, which are covered. There's a light from one of the aspects of the divine realm, which is covered over by the klipot, the husk. And this goes back to Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari's idea that the divine light was an effulgence, which the world was not able to hold. And so when it was poured into the vessels of this world shattered. What you ended up is spilled little blobs of light, almost like mercury, kind of, right? When a thermometer breaks, mercury kind of beads up. Old-fashioned thermometer, showing my age, right? And these are little blobs, right, or shreds of divine. They're called sparks, of the divine light. And they get covered over by husk, klipot, which means shells or husks, if you read an English translation of this kind of material. And it is our job to be able to dig out or ferret out the spark of divine light and free it from the husk, okay? And that distractions, apparent distractions during davening, are an example of how we do that. Does that make sense? Okay. Now I brought us up to speed. Hold on. I'm going to screen share in a moment once I find sorry, we couldn't find it. It was moved or deleted. Okay, that's not good. Here it is. Okay, give me a second. Find you again. There's you. I share my screen. I'm going to share this screen. Shared. Got it, correct? You see something?
Yes.
Okay, so again, all of this is from a book called Baal Shem Tov al HaTorah, which superficially is described to be the Baal Shem Tov, again, founder of Hasidism, first part to middle of the 18th century, 1700s. His commentary on the Chumash, it's arranged according to the Parshas. All of it is, in fact, excerpts from other books written by later Hasidim who say things like, I heard from the Baal Shem Tov, or my master heard from the Baal Shem Tov, or my father's father heard from the Baal Shem Tov. So these things were collected together and edited into a book of the Baal Shem Tov's commentary on the Torah portions. Again, the Baal Shem Tov never wrote that book. Most Hasidic masters didn't write. Most of them, their disciples, wrote down notes. So this is even sort of one step beyond. And in the middle of Parshat Noach, there's a long digression, as it were, which is really a book within a book, and that is called Amud HaTfilah, the pillar of prayer. I've been using a different translation the last few weeks. This one this week is from Sephardia. You can find all of this online in Parshat Noach. And there's some really great things to study there. And there's English translation for all of it because Sephardia is a typo here. Okay. I'm starting on the first page in English. And I sort of underlined some of the passages that I wanted to highlight. A human being is composed of numerous forces, and each one is necessary for another world. Here, he's saying our different aspects don't come different sphirot or aspects of God. It's referred to as different world, okay? And when you daven, or when you are trying to have dveikut, or cleaving to God, you're ascending, your soul is ascending, trying to ascend through these different levels, okay? And these levels have guards, and they try to keep you away. It's imagined as a king, and they're guards who don't let you get to the king, the Secret Service. Sometimes these guards send the person extraneous thoughts to push him away. But if one is wise, one can bind oneself to God even more through that very thought. Because the thought is made, as we talked about this last time, the thought is made of letters, which are the limbs of the divine presence. Limbs is in quotes, which means they are aspects of the divine. These fell among the klipot, the shells, due to the force of the breaking of the vessels, the Ari's thinking, so that the letters became arranged in an evil pattern. I think we read this last time. This is like a person who serves delicacies that are all mixed together. Each one alone is good, but when they're combined, they are repulsive. So too, this has become bad. So there are different things that are aspects of the divine. I'm gonna try to talk about them. I'm gonna try to talk tachlis here, because I realized last time some of these were vague. Let's say, here's an example. I see someone in shul. I think, oh, I can't stand that guy. And probably a real reason of why I can't stand that guy is he makes more money than me. He has a nicer house than me. He's better looking than me. Okay. So it's an angry, jealous thought. The Baal Shem Tov would say, or this approach would say, well, where does that thought come from? That thought comes from, let's say he makes more money than me. Where does that thought come from? That thought comes from, I would like to make more money because I want to take better care of my family and feel more secure, okay? So the root of the thought is actually a positive image, right? Which, I don't know, you could map that onto netzach, which is striving, maybe, okay? And the root of that is if you were seeing a therapist, okay, the therapy language would be, oh, that is a psychologically healthy impulse, okay? You are striving to have security and prosperity to take care of your family. That's a healthy thing. It's not a bad thing, okay? At this moment, that healthy impulse gets distorted into, I'm jealous of that person because he has more than me. Does everyone follow that thought? Someone follows that thought, and I do, right? So that's what your therapist would help you work out, okay? Because with a therapist, it's psychological. In a theological, more value-laden way from the Kabbalah, or more intentionally, purposefully value-laden way from the Kabbalah and from this idea, what that means is you have some impulse or feeling which is from the realm of netzach, striving. It's an aspect of divinity. It's in metaphoric language, it's a limb of God. But this piece of divine light fell and got distorted into jealousy or envy, and it is your job to see through that to liberate it. In other words, I'm going to follow this into very micro, because this is what I think this means. I think what this means is when I notice that I'm distracted by that thought, I'm supposed to pause and dig into it and try to get to, it's really because I want to protect my family as best I can. That's the root of that thought. That's the divine spark in there. and that's divine. Okay, whether it's chesed, love, or netzach, striving, or some combination of the two. All right, and I'm supposed to, as it were, liberate the core of that thought from the way in which it gets distorted. I want to pause for a moment. Is that clear? Does anyone have any questions about that? And you could make this about lots of other things, right? An angry thought, a jealous thought, again, they're hung up on sex, a lustful thought, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. I changed my view, so I can't see my screen sharing. Can you see the text still?
Yes.
Why can't I? Okay, hold on. I changed my view, and so now I cannot share. Oh, now I can, sort of. Okay. Yeah. I made it weird. Hold on. Sorry. Okay. Now I messed up my own view. This has nothing to do with you. Okay. But when one understands, I'm near the bottom of the page, but when one understands the nature of the thought, if it is desire, then it has fallen from the world of desire. If negative fear, from the world of fear. If pride, from the world of tiferet. Okay. And so on. All that fell from the 7 days of building, which sounds like 7 days of creation, but I believe is a metaphor for the 7 lower sfirot. Remember, Keter, crown, is the infinite. We can't know anything about it ever. Then there's Chokhmah and Bina, I'm taking you back like a few months, right? Wisdom and discernment, which are also divine and very hard to access. And then the 7 aspects of God, 7 out of 10, are called the 7 lower sfirot, and those are the ones that flow down to us more directly and that also have mirrors within us. They're aspects of us and they're aspects of the divine. I think that's what they mean by the 7 days of building. So all that fell from 7 days of building. Okay, sorry. You understand the nature of the thought and that it all fell down from, let's call it, a divine root. And one binds them to God through their original root, love or fear of the Creator, then you are returning that thought to its source. You're recognizing that thought comes from a divine place, and you are returning it to its divine root. Okay. And when you bind it to that attribute, the shells fall away. I think we read this last week in a different translation. Okay. God takes great pleasure in this. It's like the son of a king who has fallen into captivity. When they bring him to the king is much more pleased than had his son been with him all the time. It is the joy of the king who says, you freed my child, the sovereign. Imagine the joy of the reuniting, right? God is happy. Joy. This goes back to Heschel. We talked about how in the prophets, God has feelings, right? God is a quasi-personality with feelings. And imagine God's joy that you were able to do this, that you were able to redeem this captive thought from the world of schmutz. When a person has a foreign, next passage. When a person has a foreign thought, that's a typo, during prayer or Torah study, this is Noach comment 108, one should break that thought and attach oneself to God. Through this, you repair the holy spark that is in that thought. So it's actually a tikkun when you do that. Okay, next metaphor about this. It's on the next page. Quote from the Talmud. How does one dance before the bride? Beit Shammai says, the bride as she is. Beit Hillel says, a pleasant and gracious bride. So you may have studied this in Talmud or heard it quoted. Disagreement between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Okay. Ketzad mirakdin lifnei hakala. And this is actually a very popular Ashkenazi wedding song. The words are Ketzad mirakdin lifnei hakala, Ketzad mirakdin lifnei hakala. So the Talmud says, what do we, when we're dancing before the bride at a wedding, it's actually concrete, what do we say? Beit Hillel, I'm going to start with Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel says, she is a beautiful bride. That's what we say to every bride. To every bride we say, you're a beautiful bride. Okay? Beit Shammai says, no. The bride as she is, meaning if the bride is not beautiful, you don't say she's beautiful. If she's homely, you might say, the bride is so smart. The bride is so kind. the bride comes from a good family, you will find positive things to say about the bride that are true. But you don't say that every bride is beautiful if, in fact, the bride is not beautiful. Okay? And of course, we can, we're not going to jump into the discussion about different personalities of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, because you've heard that before. But I want to make sure that everyone understands that little piece of Talmud. We didn't get yet to how it applies to this whole thing. But does everyone get that little piece of Talmud? The Baal Shem Tov explained their disagreement as follows. This is what it really means. Beit Shammai said to praise the bride as she is, even in a general way, by knowing that God's glory is hidden everywhere. Beit Hillel said to praise the grace and beauty of the bride, for he knew the specific sparks of holiness that had fallen among the shells, and how the foreign thoughts come to mind during prayer in order to be repaired. Then one must separate and remove the shell, and to raise and adorn the holy spark from among it, making it into a lovely and graceful bride. So the Baal Shem Tov says, and by the way, he uses this passage numerous times, what this machloket, this division, really means is that thing that we've been saying you're supposed to do, which is you're supposed to find the core divine thing in it, to liberate that thought and elevate it to the realm of the holy. That's just the Beit Hillel approach. The Beit Shammai approach is just to know, these thoughts somehow come from God. So this is actually a tachlis, or practical outcome, disagreement, according to the Baal Shem Tov. What are you actually supposed to do when you have distracting thoughts during davening? Beit Hillel would say, you're supposed to dig into that thought and figure out how it actually has a root in the divine. And when you're doing that, I'll now mix it with the other passage, the king is overjoyed because you have returned the captive child to the king, right? You've done this great thing. You've dug into that thought, and you figured out how it comes from a more sacred, again, it's used in psychological, non-theological terms, a healthy place. It comes from a healthy place. It becomes unhealthy and distorted because of your distortion. Beit Shammai says, no, you don't have to do that. By the way, Beit Hillel's advice, your davening would take a long time, I think, yeah? You have distracting thought, you'd have to stop and think, where does that thought come from, right? Oh, I realize it comes from this positive impulse, which has a root in the divine. It comes from the sphera or the attribute of God, whatever. Then I can go on with my davening. That's what Beit Hillel would have you do, okay? Find the beauty in the bride. Dig for the beauty in the bride. Beit Shammai says it's enough to say, look, the bride is what she is, meaning I had that distracting thought. I think there's divine in there somewhere. Let's move on, right? Even in a general way, knowing that God's glory is hidden everywhere. Somehow this distracting thought must be related to God. I got to go on with my job. That's my understanding of the Baal Shem Tov's metaphoric, allegoric interpretation of this. I want to pause for any questions about it. Make sense? Does it make sense? Right? So Beit Shammai said, look, just recognize in a general way, everything comes from God. This must somehow come from God. Continue with your davening. The general awareness of the divine in everything. Beit Hillel says, no, you got to dig into it and actually find the beauty in it. Alan.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. I had always thought about this midrash is that what Hillel was saying that the bride is at least beautiful to the chatan. The kala is beautiful to the chatan, so you can always say that she is beautiful because to the chatan that's true. Does that fit in at all with respect to the Hasidic view that we're talking about now?
Well, first of all, I just want to say it's a passage, and the passage can be interpreted different ways, right? So in this way, I don't think, I think my short answer to you is no, by which I mean, I just think the Baal Shem Tov is using it differently here. You want to make it nice, she's beautiful to the Chatan, okay? And he's saying, look, the passage is saying, Beit Shammai is saying, how can you make a silk's purse out of a sow's ear, okay? In this case, it's a distracting negative thought, okay? And he seems to be saying, and you don't need to dig into how does this come from God. Just be aware that somehow everything comes from God. I think they just want to have it be on that level, because he's not really interested in interpreting it on a level of an actual bride and an actual groom. He's using it as an allegory for something else. So I don't think the Baal Shem Tov would disagree with you. I think he would just say, oh, that's not that. By the way, he would either say, that's not what I'm taking it to mean, or he might say, that's not what it really means. I mean, you never know that when someone uses a text, does that mean he thinks that's actually what Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai meant? Or is he just using the text to open an idea? I can't answer that, right? That's impossible. Did he really think this is really what they want? Another Talmudic passage, which you may be, these are from Tractate Brachot, so which gets studied a lot. So that's why. There's a passage that says, if someone says Shema Shema or Modim Modim, F.A. Shliach Tzibur, the Chazan, says Shema Shema or Modim Modim, we kick them out as a Shliach Tzibur. Probably the original pshat, that's in the Talmud, that's in the Mishnah. Probably the original pshat, simple meaning of that in context, is there were in late antiquity, in the times of the Mishnah and Talmud, people who had religious, theological beliefs, which were, I will now use the fancy religious studies word, binatarian. They believed that there were two deities. By the way, the binatarianism was not the Zoroastrianism that we're more familiar with, a God of good and God and evil, okay, two deities, good and evil, darkness and light, but rather there was a higher deity and a lower deity. There's a higher deity who kind of checked out a long time ago and left the number two deity in charge, and the number two deity in charge is the one who's messing up everything in the world, okay? Because it's a bad, less effective deity. So it's called binatarianism, okay? There were binatarians and there were Manichaeans. People believed everything was in a fight of light and darkness, good and evil. There were both. So anyone who is leading davening publicly, this is the Mishnah, who seems to be acknowledging two deities by repeating some key word twice, we assume he's a heretic. He can't be the Chazan. Does that make sense? It's sort of like, I don't know, if someone were leading shul, and they took 3 steps back at the end, they were saying Kaddish, they were the Shliach Tzibur, they were leading Kaddish Shalem, full Kaddish. They took 3 steps back, and they said, when they bowed to the left and right, they said, Oseh Shalom Yirmamav, in the name of the Father, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu, in the name of the Son, V'al Kol Yisrael V'Yirameim, in the name of the Holy Ghost. Okay? If someone did that, we would say, sit down, you can't be our chazan anymore. You are espousing a theological belief that is not part of our system. Does that analogy make sense? So that's what it was like in ancient times if you said Shema, Shema, or Modim, Modim. Everyone with me? That's just we're not up to the Baal Shem Tov yet. Rav Papa said to Abaye, quoting the Talmud, maybe he wasn't concentrating the first time. So you hear someone saying, they say, Shema Yisrael, Shema Yisrael, right? Maybe the person did that because they realized you have to have concentration for that whole line. And he realized that he doesn't have concentration. He lost his concentration. Okay. This is the Talmud still. Is he God's friend? Oh, you're making a great theological statement. It's as if you're saying, hi, Alan, how was your breakfast today? It's not like that. Oh, you didn't hear me. Hi, Alan, how was your breakfast today? You don't repeat that when you're talking to God. If he doesn't concentrate the first time, we hit him with a blacksmith's hammer until he does. Unclear what that metaphor is supposed to mean. All right, but it means, no, we don't say, oh, dude, you didn't concentrate the first time. You can say it the second. Okay, that's the Talmud. Now let's look at what the Baal Shem Tov is using. Baal Shem Tov says, but the question remains, maybe he didn't concentrate the first time and is now trying to concentrate in order to fulfill his obligation. Okay. Furthermore, why did Rav Zera in the Talmud choose the example of repeating Shema, Shema, as opposed to some other verse? Right? Why is he hung up on if he repeats that verse? We hear him repeating that verse, we yell at him. Okay. The answer lies in the meaning of accepting the yoke of heaven, Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim. A person must believe that the entire world is filled with God's glory and that no place is empty of God. God's existence is found in all of a person's thoughts, and each one of those thoughts complete structure. Adverse and foreign thoughts enter one's mind during prayer in order to be fixed and uplifted. If a person fails to believe this, he has not fully accepted the yoke of heaven, for this limits God's being. If you think God is present only when I think warm, fuzzy, kind, loving thoughts, but not when I think confused, angry, lustful, or jealous thoughts, if you think God is absent from those thoughts, you have limited God's being. This takes us back to the Ari's pan, which really goes back to the Zohar in some sense, panentheism. There is divinity in everything. And if you say, oh, that was a bad, distracting thought, I shouldn't have thought that, it interrupted my Shema. If you say that to yourself, you are denying God's presence in those thoughts. Everyone follow that? This is the meaning of that passage in the Talmud, Shema, Shema. Why did one say it twice? Most likely because he was not concentrating the first time, for he was having a foreign thought. You were distracted. You were distracted during the first line of the Shema, so you feel like you're supposed to go back and say it again. Yet, had the person realized that God's presence is there too, one would not have had to say it twice, okay? I'm going to say it, we'll finish up soon, another version of this idea. Someone once asked the Baal Shem Tov if he was allowed to go back and repeat several words of the Kriyat Shema or prayers that he said without concentration. We know the prayers what are the prayers you're supposed to say with full concentration? They are the first line of the Shema and the first paragraph of the Amidah. And there are some halachic positions that if you realize you lost the thread, you're supposed to go back and say it with kavanah. Baal Shem Tov disagrees. The Baal Shem Tov answered as follows. It is well known that God's existence is in everything. Even extraneous thoughts contain sparks of holiness. Therefore, if you say a few words of prayer without concentration while lost in the extraneous thoughts, you should know that the thought has come to have its spark removed. By repeating the word, you demonstrate that God was not there the first time you said them, and thus you limit God's existence. You should not say them twice. It's the practical. You should not say them twice. Rather, you should think about and concentrate on those words in your mind that you said first without concentration. Remember, when they say saying words, how do you actually say the Shema? You're supposed to say the Shema in a whisper, and you're supposed to say the Amidah in a whisper that only you can hear, meaning you're not supposed to just think the words. So what he's saying is, if you realize that, you didn't have concentration, you don't go back and say the words again, because if you do that, it's as if you're saying, my first words were devoid of the divine. It's worthless. Don't do that. You might pause. Actually, he doesn't say might. He says you should think about the words you said and concentrate on those words without concentration. Think about the words that you said that you originally said without concentration. I'll post there are other interesting things on the sheet. I will post it online, the podcast, if you want to read more of it. I stopped the screen share, correct?
Yes.
And you can see everyone, correct? Just checking. Okay. Now I just want to say, okay, this is a different version of the thing about Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Is it Beit Hillel or Beit Shammai? Well, it's kind of a compromise, or maybe let's say it's a clarification. The clarification is in the passages that require concentration that you are supposed to actually say, meaning your lips are moving and air is coming out of your lips. That's what I mean by saying. If you realize you lost concentration, you don't actually go back and say them again, but you do pause and you contemplate what was the divine root that distraction came from. If you actually went back and said it again, what you're saying is the divine was absent at that moment. And that thought is anathema, because the divine is in everything. By the way, this class is about the nature of God. this series that we've been doing for almost 2 years now, I said that there are several big questions, right, that any religion has to answer. What's out there? It's God. Why are we here, and what are we supposed to do? Why is there suffering in the world? And what happens after we die? The four biggies, right? This could raise very interesting questions and challenges for one of the other questions, which is, why is there suffering and evil in the world? Okay, because if it's panentheism, God is in everything, even though sometimes the divine is distorted. What that means is the divine is somehow present in suffering or human evil. Now, that's a whole other class, which is not this class. You should ask Rabbi Rembam to teach that class. Different Jewish ideas in the Rembam Institute, different Jewish ideas about the nature of evil. That would be a very interesting class indeed, okay? But that's not our topic. But I just want to point out that this panentheistic view really sharpens that question, okay? There are terrible things going on in the world at this moment, and somehow, in a distorted way, divinity is not absent from them. It is somehow present and distorted. Okay, it's a horrible, morbid thought. I just want to leave that aside and come back to our simple thoughts about our morning davening, which is that even when we're distracted, God is in there. Beit Shammai's point of view would be, you don't need to dig into it. Just realize that God was in there somewhere. Everything comes from God. Okay. Beit Hillel's view is, no, you need to it's not good enough to think that. You actually have to ferret out how it was a divine thought. And then the Baal Shem Tov adds, but you don't say the thing again in order to do that. You kind of mull it over. You don't actually repeat. Because if you're repeating, you're showing that you don't believe that God was present. I will now pause. Mr. Larry has a hand up.
Avi, this has in many ways been one of the most difficult classes for me that you've held, because it deals with so many different issues and goes off in so many different directions and has so many connections. I know you don't want to hear it, discuss it, but
I'll try to take that not as a criticism, as a teacher. Okay, go on.
Yeah,
but as maybe it's a compliment. I don't know. Go ahead.
In my chavruta with Marshall and with Joel, we're in the part of Kiddushim where we're dealing with theodicy and the original story of Elisha ben Abuya,
yeah,
and all that. And there's a segment in there which deals with thoughts and whether you can actually sin through thoughts, but you don't want to go into it here. But what I really hope to hear one day, before you get off this subject, is what you as a psychiatrist think about the subject of what I'll call invasive thoughts, and in particular, invasive thoughts during davening. Because it seems to me that you have a unique perspective, maybe not unique, but a very interesting perspective, because you understand the science and human nature, and you're also very serious about your own davening, and I'm sure about other people's davening. So I'm always grappling as I'm listening to you talk. I'm grappling about how I deal with invasive thoughts or lack of mindfulness or all these sorts of things. And I'm just not feeling satisfied yet by what we're reading about in the Baal Shem Tov and elsewhere.
I hear the question. It's not an answer. I will call it a response. My response is my understanding of what the Baal Shem Tov is saying here, which I think you can, without religious values, map a version of that response into the psychology world, is it's not useful to say that's a bad thought, I shouldn't have it. That's the wrong way to approach it. The right way to approach it is some version of, where did that thought come from? Okay. If you're a therapist, you always want to try to help. Well, I don't know about always. One of the missions of a therapist is to help a client it's like following a string back, that someone left when they were going through the forest. Follow the string back to try to get to, so where did, again, let's just talk about therapy. Where did that maladaptive behavior, or where did that counterproductive thought come from? Where did it come from? How did it get there? Let's follow the string back in terms of in your psyche about how it got there. Well, it's because when I was a child, they never, whatever you're supposed to get to in deep psychotherapy, right? What's that thought come from? Or, your rigid OCD thought about, checking that the windows are locked 30 times. It comes from something about safety, vigilance, meaning what's the core human, and it might not be pan-human, it might be pan-human, or it might be just your particular human, core human impulse, feeling, need that comes from, okay? And the Baal Shem Tov is saying a theologicized version of that, or we could put it the other way around, because which came first, theology or psychology? The answer is theology, right? So psychology, Freud basically tried to say, no, none of it comes from out there. It all comes from in here, okay? And you have to trace back to where it comes from in here, whereas the theological view is it's all connected to out there. Everything is all connected. There's divine in everything. There is divine in you. There's divine in the flowers that are in front of me on the counter. There's divine in everything. Nothing. God is not late atar de panui mine. I believe it is in Aramaic, which the Hasidim say, which is there is no place in which God is absent. There's no place devoid of divinity. It might be from the Tanya, it's either from the Baal Shem Tov or the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I'm not quite sure who. Sorry, or maybe I'll look it up for next week. Late atar panui mine. There is no place devoid of the divine. If you wanted to denature this and have it be less divine and have it be psychological, it's okay. There's no thought or impulse that you have that where there is not present in it some core human need. Even if, by the way, this is the nature of evil, even if what you do is actually kill somebody, that's the part that's much harder, because that's where we say, I saw the face of evil with a capital E, as if we are Manichaeans. And we said, there's good and there's evil. And I'm not saying that view is absent from Judaism. By the way, just as you're studying that with, there's no such thing as what's the Jewish attitude towards evil, just as there's no such thing as what's the Jewish understanding of God. The whole point of my course, this class, is to say there are lots of different understandings of God, okay? And we all put pieces of it together in different ways at different times, because we are not a philosophical algorithm that has only one. We're not an algebra proof, right? We're more like the uncertainty principle. I'm now out of my depth here, okay? So I don't have an answer. The answer is, but the Baal Shem Tov's answer seems to be, you can trace everything back. It is a worthy task to try to trace that thought or that impulse. Again, we can, if you want to expand this beyond interrupting thoughts and davening, okay, if you just want to expand it to say, base thoughts in general, thoughts that we're ashamed of, right, or that we know we're not supposed to have, or that are counterproductive. The Baal Shem Tov says, no, you don't just say, oh, that's just a bad thought. You got to squash that. You got to figure out, where does that come from? What's the root of that? Yes, it's distorted, and again, their word for distorted in psychotherapy, you might call it distorted, okay? In the Ari's language, he would say there's a spark of light that's imprisoned in a husk, and we need to liberate it. I think it's different kinds of vocabulary and different kinds of framework for saying a similar thing, or at least that's my argument. I'm arguing that they're saying a sort of similar thing. Sorry, I went on. That's it's not my answer. It's my response. I'm responding. So nine to be continued. To be TBD. 9 a.m. Have a good day. Be Torah. Stay healthy. God willing, we will meet again next week.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.